Salvete omnes, this is Lisa Klein with my presentation on the article The Silence of Vergil and the End of the Aeneid. It was originally the work of Robert J. Edgeworth, and it was posthumously edited by Rex Stem. It's from Vergilius, and you can find the bibliographical information and a stable JSTOR link below if you'd like to read the full article. In this article, Edgeworth explores the final scene of the Aeneid, in which Aeneas must decide how to deal with Turnus. Edgeworth points out that the readers are left without editorial comment from Vergil concerning Aeneas' actions, and the readers are left without a full answer for how Aeneas acts. What does he do with Turnus' body? Does he desecrate it in the vein of Achilles and Hector? Or does he immediately give it back to Turnus' father for burial, as Turnus himself had begged? Edgeworth argues that these are essential questions that are important to the interpretation of the entire poem. He writes, "By his very silence on certain points, Vergil reinforces the ambivalence of the poem's final scene. Thus, the silence of Vergil is interpretively significant and suggests a new perspective on the much-debated end of the poem." His full thesis, though, seems to come later in the article, when he says, "Vergil's probable intent, I argue, is that the reader both be horrified at the enormity of Aeneas' failure in the moral order and be relieved that by his failure the proper eschatological order of events is secured." Edgeworth doesn't jump right into the final passage, though. He begins by showing a pair of examples in which Vergil leaves significant silence elsewhere in the Aeneid. The first of these significant silences is in Book 6, during Aeneas' journey to the underworld. Literary tradition has built up a long list of persons usually spotted during these journeys. Homer in his Odyssey listed Tydeus, Tantalus, and Sisyphus. Lucretius listed Tydeus, Tantalus, Sisyphus, and the Danaids. Tibullus listed Tydeus, Ixion, and the Danaids. Horace also listed Tydeus, Ixion, and the Danaids. And Ovid listed Tydeus, Tantalus, Sisyphus, Ixion, and the Danaids. Vergil follows this literary tradition, and in fact has an extensive, comprehensive list of all of those mentioned above, with the exception of the Danaids. Edgeworth writes, "Why not? Does Vergil not think their deeds worthy of condemnation to Tartarus? Vergil's silence about their condition stands against the expectation of the literary tradition, a silence that adds significance to where they do ultimately appear in the poem. And as we know, where they do ultimately appear in the poem is on the baldric of Pallas, which has particular significance in the silence at the end of the Aeneid." Edgeworth writes, "Masterfully, it is the sight of Pallas's baldric which tips the scales for Aeneas, the baldric on which is engraved the infamous acts of the Danaids. Now we can understand why Vergil does not tell us whether the Danaids are in hell. Their deed is also Aeneas' deed." The second significant silence, other than the final lines of the Aeneid, appears in Book 10, when Aeneas plans human sacrifices to honor Pallas. This, too, is modeled on Homer. In the Iliad, Achilles takes 12 prisoners to sacrifice to the dead Patroclus. Homer makes the situation explicitly clear. Achilles kills them in front of Patroclus's pyre. Aeneas, like Achilles, takes 8 prisoners of war to sacrifice to Pallas, an act that would have seemed an imitation to the ancient audiences who have read the Iliad. Vergil, though, makes the situation less than clear. He has Aeneas mimic Achilles' intent, but we don't learn the actual fate of the prisoners. Instead of killing them himself in front of a pyre or a grave, Aeneas sends the prisoners to Evander, and we don't find out whether they live or die. Edgeworth writes, "Do they live or die? Does Clementia trump furor?" Either way, the outcome would have had strong implications for one's reading of the end of the poem, but instead, what we get is silence. Knowing Aeneas' actions here would seemingly inform the reader of his character and allow one to hypothesize about how Aeneas treats Turnus at the end of the epic, but we are left with silence here and there. Since Edgeworth's main question is how Aeneas deals with Turnus at the end of the Aeneid, I thought it was important to take a quick look at the lines themselves. I've posted the Latin library text and the Loeb translation, and I'd like to highlight a few lines. Edgeworth concerns himself with Turnus' plea and Aeneas' agreement or refusal, but if you look at the plea itself, you will notice that it is dual-fold and conditional. It's not simple. Turnus admits his defeat and says, "Give back me, or, if so thou please, my lifeless body to my kin." He asks to be returned to his people, dead or alive, with the understanding that the return of his lifeless body would be for a proper burial. Continuing on, Aeneas is almost swayed by these words. until he sees the aforementioned baldric on Turnus. This is the point where Aeneas changes. He had been hesitant about his actions toward Turnus, but now his eyes are cruel, he himself is fired with fury and terrible in his wrath, and he murders Turnus for Pallas's honor. But the real significant point, as Edgeworth argues, is that Vergil never tells us whether Turnus's body will be sent back to his people for burial. The final lines of the poem just show his death, not what happens to his body. Now to analyze this silence. Edgeworth notes that the customary view is that Aeneas rejects Turnus's plea. Well, he certainly rejects the first plea, but it is astonishing that Vergil refuses to tell us whether the second plea will be granted or denied. If Vergil were to follow his Homeric model, we should know what happened to the corpse of the fallen antagonist. Edgeworth argues that Homer's preoccupation with the proper treatment of the corpse of a fallen foe is prominent throughout the Iliad. Achilles showed proper respect for Andromache's deceased father. Hector and Ajax swear before the first fight to return the body of the loser, and Hector proposes the same pact to Achilles, who at first refuses but later does return the body to Priam. Vergil, though, has managed to tell us what will happen to Aeneas, that he will die before his time and be deified, but does not tell us about Turnus. Why? One might hypothesize that Aeneas will return the body based off of his previous inclination towards such actions. He returned Lausus' body, but Edgeworth argues that the scenarios are very different. Aeneas, when killing Lausus, is miserans, and Lausus is a miseran de puer. But while killing Turnus, Aeneas is furis acensus et ira terribilis, very different characterizations. It seems that the real issue, though, is not what happened to Turnus's body, for we will never be able to answer that question, but rather, why does this matter at all? Does the treatment of Turnus's corpse make any difference? Edgeworth argues that Homer expresses judgment on the moral quality of his characters emphatically in the case of Achilles' abuse of Hector's corpse. Homer calls Achilles' abuse of Hector's body disgraceful deeds, and he describes Achilles' acceptance of Priam's ransom as not disgraceful. He says, too, that reconciliation is the main theme of Iliad Book 24, but absent from Aeneid Book 12. There is no reconciliation in Aeneid Book 12 between Aeneas and Daunus after Turnus' death. Through this silence, in which he leaves open both the possibility that the body of Turnus be shamefully abused by Aeneas and the possibility that it be returned with proper honors, Vergil directly contributes to the uncertainty about Aeneas' moral standing at the end of the poem. Scholars have argued for and against Aeneas' moral character based on his actions. Those pro-Aeneas argue that Aeneas does what is right and proper killing Turnus, rejecting his plea for mercy. Those anti-Aeneas argue that Aeneas fails in his mission, abandoning his obligations to Pietas and Clementia in a surrender to that sense of furor which has been, in various guises, the villain of the poem. Edgeworth doesn't want to pick sides, instead arguing, I contend that each view is largely correct, but faulty in assuming that we must choose between the two. Aeneas both triumphs and fails. Vergil's poem is concerned both with the moral dimension and with the eschatological dimension of human choices. Vergil's probable intent, I argue, is that the reader both be horrified at the enormity of Aeneas' failure in the moral order and be relieved that by his failure the proper eschatological order of events is secured. Looking at the larger picture of the implications of Aeneas' actions, Edgeworth argues that Aeneas does what must be done precisely because he succumbs to the demonic force of rage, which saves the day when virtue fails, even though we are repulsed by moral ugliness. At first, I took issue with that statement, until I kept reading and I saw his supplementary arguments. He writes that mercy is assumed to be always the better choice, but Vergil knew that Clementia exercised by the great Julius ultimately brought disaster both to the man and to the Roman world, while the horrors of the prescriptions proved to be a prelude to the Pax Augusta. Perhaps it is true that the ends occasionally justify the means. Edgeworth took it a step further and characterized the entire Aeneid as a statement on the nature of human character. The Aeneid itself is a baldric, a great work of art which depicts the bivalent nature of human action. Vergil knows about the darkness within the human heart, and he shows it to us plainly here at the end of the Aeneid. This last quotation rang true for me in my assessment of Aeneas' character. He's a flawed human hero, well depicted as such in the Aeneid. And I'm ending with the title slide once again, in case you'd like to see the URL for the JSTOR link. I highly recommend that you read the entire article. Found it very interesting. Thanks.